Hello, Internet. Now we're going to talk about something that we don't usually talk because normally we're going to talk about news and stuff like that. But today we're going to talk about a movie that recently released and got a lot, I think one of the highest rating in Rotten Tomatoes. And what is the movie that we meant?
So we're going to talk about probably for me, even though this is very early in the year, I think is movie of the year, which is Dune Part 2. So if any of you have watched the first movie and haven't watched the second movie, I highly recommend it. It is a cinematic masterpiece. It is a spectacle to behold and definitely something worth your money.
Yeah, and how do you like it as a movie?
Well, I read the book and I fell in love with the book a long time ago. I haven't read the second or third book. I just know what happens. But I mean, Denis Villeneuve, the director, definitely did his homework. He knew what the book was all about, and definitely adapted it very well to the big screen. And this was amazing because Dune itself, as a novel, was you can consider the godfather or the pioneer for science fiction back then, and it was amazing to see that science fiction back then wasn't really that popular, but here comes Frank Herbert, the author, coming out with this sprawling story with a lot of metaphysical, very spiritual themes alongside tribal conflict and feudal conflict as well. So I love the movie. How about you, Haffisz?
Well, I have not read the book. I think the first time I heard about Dune when it was first released in 2021. I don't even know the first rendition of. I think it was in 1980s,
I
70s.
think we were at your house watching it, right? A
Yeah,
few years back before the first movie came out.
exactly. And we laugh at it like how horrible was the animation and the camera tricks. But hey, it's. I think I'm sure it was very good at their time back then. As a movie, Eddie, I'm not really a fan of sci-fi, but here's my take. I think the storyline is as typical as any Bollywood movie. Why do I say that? Because you got a young boy, very privileged, surrounded by people that having hope for him. So in a Hollywood setting, it would be like one rich boy that villages were hoping for him to do something good for the greater good for all of them. And then at the end, he had to marry a girl that he's not in love with. So this is very typical of Bollywood storyline,
Fairy
and but
tale.
fairy tale, yeah. And but apart from that, I do believe that Denis Villeneuve is the right director to actually manifest Frank Herbert imagination in this movie with the vivid cinematography. Like I'm not a movie buff or whatever, but I can feel it, like how every shot, I really there's one scene where it was the Harkonnen cousins, I think, when the fight, the gladiator fight.
You mean Austin Butler's character? Oh, the nephew.
Oh yeah, so yeah, that one. So I think it was very surreal with the color is just black and white because for us we were trained to think that black and white is a flashback, but not in that sense. It's just a different sensation to have it.
Yeah, I watched it in IMAX, and it was really an experience. That particular scene was just fantastic because it adds a lot or depth to the Harkonnen planet. Basically, it adds more of that surrealist, that very gothic and military feeling and vibe that they had. I just want to mention here is that I mean we're not I'm not movie buff myself as well. If you want like very step by step review, then you can check the Goggler podcast. They're going
Yeah.
to do a much better job. But
Yep.
I think what we kind of want to talk here is a lot of the themes that were happening in Dune because Frank Herbert, he had a lot of inspiration when writing Dune based off of stuff like ecology. He went to the Americas and saw a lot of like landscapes, which was definitely the inspiration for Arrakis, the desert planet. But the culture of the people that the main hero Paul Atreides finds himself immersed in, which is the Fremen, has a lot of resemblances to a lot of North African, Middle Eastern culture,
But Bedouin
and
culture, yeah.
Bedouin culture, Berber, even a bit of Persian, Iranian, and you can also sense a bit of a Buddhist and Hindu elements at play here. And it was very fascinating. And the fact that he did a lot of studying and a lot of preparation to actually understand what these cultures were about, and using that as a way to deliver the themes of the movie, trying to bring out the message that the whole idea of messianism, the idea of messiah, worshipping messianic figures, is more of a cautionary tale. And definitely, if you watch Dune, you would feel that sense, that feeling. Like, if you haven't watched the movie and you don't want to hear spoilers, then this is your warning.
Mm-hmm.
And I mean, okay, moving into it is that when you look at Paul, he set up as, you know, this Bollywood fantasy fairy tale character, but throughout the progress, if you watch through the film, he ended up almost like a warlord, a desert warlord that had to do very terrible things to achieve some of his goals, and he had to manipulate a lot of people using indigenous cultures to play off this idea that he is some savior, this messiah that came from the stars to liberate these people. And that's kind of an underhanded tactic which no noble hero would actually use. So it was an inversion of the whole typical savior hero archetype. But you know, before I get more into that, I mean, Hafiz, what did you pick up from these kinds of themes and these kinds of cultural representations?
Yeah, I mean, but Frank Herbert was not shy to even use one by one, because inspiration is not inspiration, but he even called Paul as a Mahdi. You know, the actual word that we in Islam use, like the one, the Messiah, so the Imam Mahdi. So the word, literal word, the Muaddib as well. So these are direct borrowing from the Arabic word. So yeah, of course, other things also bit subtle, but not in certain things. So I don't think Frank Herbert wants to shy away from where the inspiration he drew. It's just like how he very nicely mix the, like you said, like Hinduism, Buddhism, Christianity, and Islam influence in one very, I'm just gonna say, excellent movie. Yeah, but again, there are 6 books, Adi, if I'm not mistaken. So how does it go about? Because from what I heard, the part 1 and part 2, it's not just from the one book. So how does it work? Is it
Well, the part one and part two is basically the first book, and the first book and the second movie ended right where you would move on to the second book, which is Dune Messiah, and that is a huge, like, it takes the whole idea of the holy war or the jihad to another level, and it's very crazy kind of setup, and all kinds of violence and chaos ensues, which I think it does kind of play to the whole idea of how messianic figures, that, I mean, people who claim to be the Messiah, tends to destroy the old order and reconstitute a new one in their image. They would break down all the social conventions and traditional norms that has been set up by a lot of cultural practices and indigenous practices over thousands of years, and then they would come and then they reconstitute it. You know, the idea of with destruction comes rebirth, and that is doing the same. So if you look at the first book and second movie, it's just a setup for that. The destruction is beginning, and then the second and third book moves into that whole theme of bringing rise to a new order. But then again, if you look at, you know, third book onwards, it becomes a cyclical pattern that it plays into this idea that if you follow certain figures who claims to be your savior, you would commit all kinds of, you'll be very charged to commit all kinds of actions through a very emotional capacity, a very romantic capacity as well. So that's how it works.
Yeah, and certain inspiration also, like Lisan Al Gaib. There was an, actually, I think, Islamic scholar was titled Lisan Al Gaib. So I think that's the direct reference. I think when we talk about Lisan Al Gaib in the movie as well as what we have in real life. So also the entire movie tried to. I think this is what I get from the movie. It's just like you said, how certain, like in this case, very, very hardcore supporters, like people, religious extremists, that because of the situation, because of the spice that actually they live on the planet that full of resources, but because of this Harkonnen, the what is Paul's
The
ethnicity,
Atreides,
Atreides,
the
also
Atreides family.
they fight over the spice, but people actually that living on that planet was living in poverty. So like they even describe the south path, it's inhabitable, like no one wants to live there, but there are people actually had to live there. So even though the place is blessed with the spices, so-called spice, but yet this is ongoing, like since I think the beginning of Adam and Eve, like how people in Palestine, for example, if you want to draw inspiration, people in, for us in Malaysia as well, for Sabah Sarawak as well, like we have a lot of oil reserve, whatnot. Petronas year after year announce more reserve, they found more reserve, but people actually living in the actual territory actually have to ration their electricity. So it's a political movie for me. Like, and I think this is the kind of theme that very universally accepted by anyone. You don't need a proper translation to this. Even I think the script is very succinct to me. Like for a movie that long, almost 3 hours, the script is very very short to me, especially from Paul as well. I think the only time that he extensively talked about lengthy when he was revealing himself as the savior in that cave. Yeah. So I think this is very
Yeah,
different movie.
just 2 points on that is because Frank Herbert didn't try to hide the fact that the book itself was an allegory for colonialism. He definitely drew inspirations from leaders that were active, like military freedom fighters that were active in that region, the Middle East and Africa, North Africa. Like you could easily draw a lot of parallels to people like Lawrence of Arabia, Emir Abdul Qadir in Algeria, being all these people who came somewhat from like an outside as in kind of background and led and united groups of tribes people to fight against the whole colonial machine that is seeking to oppress them, trying to keep them down just for the sake of exploitation of resources. And to be able to adapt that into a sci-fi setting was kind of unheard of in a way. Like in a way, Dune was a very one of the early postmodern works of sci-fi that challenges like all these preconceived notions that colonialism was on net benefit to humanity when in fact it wasn't, and it was portrayed very well. And second, when you talk about the script, this is why it was considered almost impossible to adapt Dune, is because a lot of the writing in the book is done in a way where you're reading the character's thoughts. You're barely, I mean, there is dialogue, but most of the dialogue happens inside the character's head. So we look at it from the character's point of view. So in a way, I think Denis Villeneuve had to make a lot of compromises here. He had to balance out the exposition so that the audience can relate, at the same time having to rely on the direction of the actors to convey certain feelings and emotions just through their facial expressions, which I think the cast did perfectly. I think almost 90% of the casting was extremely spot on, and they really looked exactly like how I would picture the characters coming from the book being brought to life, essentially. But I mean, that's the technical side. But I mean, going back to the whole idea of drawing parallels from the real world here. I mean, just to put in more context as well, is that because you mentioned the idea of Mahdi is also has an Islamic parallel in real life to the idea of the savior, and how it's drawn a lot from the 12 verse Shiite tradition. Then you see this whole idea of spice being consciousness expanding substance that's able for you to transcend in a way, transcend your mental faculties and mental limitations. That's not too different from a lot of Sufi traditions. Like Ibn Arabi had this whole idea of unity of being, which was very reminiscent to that. Other things that you could see drew out from was the idea of the Bene Gesserit's idea of Mahdi, which was the Qizat Hadrak. That's a Hebrew. It's based off a Hebrew word, which means for someone to jump from one path to another, which essentially does translate into the journey that the main character Paul went through. So I just find it very fascinating that Frank Herbert was able to mix in all of these ideas. He was exposed to all these ideas, and he gave it the proper representation it had. Like I've seen people calling this like, "Oh, Dune is what Black Panther was for Black people," like how, and Dune is the same thing for a lot of Middle Eastern people. So when you draw that allegory from, like, you can see this also happening in Palestine, in North Africa. You're not too far off the mark. It's a very timeless story, one that's definitely fits the themes of oppression, rebellion, and through that rebellion, you could eventually fall in and succumb into the trappings of power, which you could argue Paul did towards the end of the movie. So very fascinating.
Well, you read the book. Is there any modification in compared to the movie?
I mean, there were some artistic liberties taken, but I think it was for the best. I mean, the only real changes I felt was, and this is very minor change, like very nitpicking. Me and Ifti like had a whole like dispute over it. It's like how back in the first movie you had Josh Brolin's character and Jason Momoa's character. We always felt that they should have switched places actually, because it fits their character and their style a bit more. Another thing was that Paul's sister Alia, who was portrayed by Anya Joy Taylor, who was portrayed as a grown adult, as a mental image to Paul. She was actually just a little girl in the books. She was already 4 years old towards the end of the books. Like, okay, so in a way, the books kind of tells a story that happens for several years, about 2 to 3 or 4 years, and it had more elements that kind of motivated Paul. Like Paul had more motivation to do the things that he did in the books, but I think they had to remove that for the sake of making the script a bit more palatable and more leaner, so that it can tell a more cohesive story. This is definitely a story where they emphasized a lot on Paul and Zendaya's character Chani in their budding romance story. There was a lot more happening around them, which didn't really get that much focus on compared to how it did in the books. It was much richer, kind of smaller details that was happening in the background in the books.
What's your take on Javier Bardem character compared in part one and part two? Because part two he more like of a Joker the entire movie, but compared to part one, he's very the guy that leading the
Oh
Freeman
yeah.
tribe or
Yeah.
whatever.
This was also another nitpick here, because I always felt like they were trying to, and I think this was an executive decision from like producers in Hollywood, not Denis Villeneuve decision. Is that I felt like a creeping feeling of like the Marvel tier kind of humor, like just one-liners that kind of diffuses all kinds of tension. Like I remember when he was like asking Zendaya's character to be quiet because they were praying, and I remember people in the cinema laughing, like it was a Marvel joke. I was like, no, that's not. I don't think that's supposed to be a joke. This is a guy like asking you to respect his culture and tradition. He's praying, he's giving thanks to a certain event that was prophesized. So that was a issue I had with characterizing of Javier Bardem, because when I imagine his character, right? Have you watched the Kingdom of Heaven, right?
Yeah.
So Saladin's character, right,
Yep.
in that
Yep.
movie. I imagine Javier Bardem's character to be exactly like that. And Ifti and me just like had the same idea. Like, yeah, he looked exactly like the quintessential desert warlord who was very
Mm-hmm.
righteously charged, very charismatic, very charismatic. And that's what I thought he would be portrayed as, because in the book he was that kind of character.
Yeah, in part two, he more like a joker and lunatic, this hardcore believer of
Yeah.
Lisan Al Gaib. Like every time that he
Yeah.
mentioned, I mean, you can take a sip of your drink every time he mentioned Lisan Al Gaib, Lisan Al Gaib. So there was
That's true. That's true.
this was a switch, I think, in part one and part two for Javier Bardem character.
Mm.
Yeah, that's I think the what we want to talk about.
I mean, Dune is really something where the more you look into it, the more details unravel. Really, if like any of you really do like Dune, or you like the idea of Dune, you should really like check out this one documentary movie that came out 10 years ago. Because Dune was attempted, I think at least 5 or 6 years before David Lynch tried it in '84. This was done by Alejandro Jodorowsky, who was this erudite madman, very surrealist character. If you watch The Holy Mountain, you know what kind of director he was, and he like was so ambitious with the movie. He wanted to make it like a 14-hour movie, and he wanted to have Salvador Dali play as the Emperor, Orson Welles as the Baron Harkonnen. Mick Jagger was also supposed to be in the movie. The music was supposed to be done by Pink Floyd. It was extremely ambitious and never got through. And it's fantastic because like you could see how much H.R. Geiger was also one of the artists behind the Harkonnens for his project. And the movie didn't go through, and then all the people that he brought in, the creative people, they went on to do things like Alien, that kind of, and Terminator as well. So you can see a lot of the DNA of not just Dune as a book, but Dune as a potential movie back then, just having its fingers in almost every sci-fi piece of media as we know it. So in a way, Dune, if it wasn't a book, we wouldn't maybe you wouldn't have things like Star Wars. You wouldn't have things like Alien or Terminator. So it really changed the whole landscape when it came to sci-fi media and literature. So if you really want to know more, you really got to check out that documentary. It was extremely ambitious and in a way ahead of it, very ahead of its time. Like I'm a huge supporter that the vision should have been fulfilled. Like, Ifti hugely disagrees. He thinks it's full of quackery, like just some crazy old man trying to
If this
ruin
our mutual friend, yeah.
yeah. He's just like saying that this guy's trying to ruin the Dune as we know. So I think there was something more to it, and it's glad to see that Dune is represented in a very balanced way. Because if you looked at okay, I'm going really along on a tangent here, but just one more thing, if just to play it home, that the spice extractor, the design that
Yes.
had a huge resemblance to the design that H.R. Geiger had and worked on almost 40, 50 years ago. So it transcends time. It's a timeless book. It's a timeless story. It's a timeless, and I think it's going to be a timeless movie in many, many years to come. So please do go watch it, go support. In a way, this kind of inverted Hollywood's expectations, and maybe it could change the landscape of sci-fi movies as we know it.
Yeah, and all of us know now that Adi is a hardcore Dune fan here, die-hard fan. For those who are listening, we are not talking about news because starting next week, we're going to introduce to a new format, which is 2+1. 2 means news and all the issues that are happening, current affairs. But another one is a topic that we might talk about that not necessarily about news and current issues. It could be something about religion. It could be something about property prices or economy topic, very academic that we want to channel on Kopitiam Council. So if you would like to request any of the topic, please, if you're listening on Spotify, you can just answer our Q&A. On every our podcast episode on Spotify, there will be a Q&A. So please go and put down what you think. And if you're listening this on YouTube, please comment down below what topics that would you like to have us to have. With that, Adi, that's it for this episode. Goodbye for now.